What turns a soldier's daughter into one of the most dangerous women in Birmingham? And when a life leaves more police reports than love letters, where do we begin to find the person who once lived beneath those headlines? You're listening to Filed Lives. Tell me where you are tonight. Perhaps you're sitting by a dim lamp or lying in the stillness of a late hour. I invite you to listen slowly, to breathe with the story, and if these forgotten lives speak to you, I hope you'll stay with us. Subscribe and walk through their quiet echoes. The year is 1877. The empire stands at its height, vast, confident, and unbearably hot beneath the Bengal sun, in a British military garrison known as Jhansi, spelled Jansi in the fading script of the record. A cry of an infant rises among the bugle calls and the shuffle of soldiers' boots. Her name will be written as Alice Mor Tatlo, the daughter of John Tatlo, armorer sergeant of the 109th Regiment of Foot, and his wife Mary Ann. The record that preserves her birth is unlike the familiar English registry bound in leather and parchment. This one belongs to the India Office, a colonial document written in tidy, careful ink. Born 27 August 1877, baptized 20 September. Beneath those lines, a whole geography of distance unfolds. For every British child born east of Suez, the empire kept a separate file, as if to remind the future that their lives began not in Britain, but in a foreign sky. Imagine the cantonmen at dawn, whitewashed barracks, the clang of metal against metal as weapons are checked and cleaned, the faint tremor of drums rolling across the parched ground. The soldiers stand in perfect ranks, sweating under wool uniforms not made for this climate. Beyond them, the women of the regiment's families, wives, mothers, and nurses, move quietly between huts, carrying infants shaded by thin cloths. They are part of the Army's machinery, though no medals ever bear their names. Mary Ann Tatlo was one of them. For every man who carried a rifle, a woman carried water, linen, and the burden of distance. She lived in a world circled by walls, ruled by the regimental bell, where each day meant waiting for the post from home that rarely came. Disease crept through these settlements like a silent campaign. Cholera, malaria, typhoid. Infants were buried so often that small crosses stood even behind the officers' mess. For Alice to survive her first months was a kind of miracle, one not recorded but quietly earned by her mother's care. Her father, Sergeant John Tatlo, held a position both trusted and technical. The armorer sergeant kept the regiment's weapons in readiness: rifles, bayonets, revolvers. He was the keeper of precision and order, the unseen hand behind the regiment's strength. Within the strict hierarchy of 19th century military life, his rank placed the family in modest comfort. Above the privates, below the officers, always disciplined, always respectable. Perhaps it was in this atmosphere of command and obedience that Alice first learned the sound of rules, the measured tone of orders barked across a parade ground, the rhythm of boots on hard earth. A child's first music is the pattern of her parents' world, and hers was one of iron and duty. Yet beneath the surface order, there was fragility. The families of the garrison lived between two worlds, British by law yet far from Britain, bound to a power they could neither see nor change. Their letters home spoke of longing more than pride. Some dreamt of returning to green fields. Others had been abroad so long they feared England would feel foreign. When the Indian Rebellion had ended 20 years earlier, the Crown took direct control of India, and the Army's presence became the steel backbone of empire. But the soldiers were not conquerors in their own eyes. They were workers of a vast machine, following orders, serving a queen whose portrait hung in every mess hall. To be born into that system was to inherit both prestige and distance, pride and dislocation. For Alice, these contradictions would never leave her. In later years, when police clerks wrote down her name, they always noted her birthplace, India. It was a mark that set her apart, a tiny fragment of imperial geography following her through every cell and courtroom. The empire that gave her birth also gave her difference, a sense of belonging nowhere. By the early 1880s, the 109th Regiment was ordered home. Ships left Bombay packed with men in faded uniforms and children pale from the journey. On the passenger lists were the Tatlos. The tropic heat gave way to damp air and English rain. The bright cantonment walls were replaced by brick barracks under gray skies. They settled in Aldershot, Hampshire, the beating heart of the British Army at home. In the 1881 census, the family appears like a framed photograph in words. John Tatlo, armorer sergeant, Mary Ann, wife, children, John Robert, Alice M. The little girl is 3 years old, listed as scholar, a quiet declaration of hope that she might grow into literacy and grace. Her birthplace, India, is carefully recorded, as if the clerk feared that such a detail might slip away with time. The Aldershot camp was a world of repetition and order, dawn parades, evening roll calls, the scent of oil and metal, the chorus of bugles at sunset. For children, there were schools run by the regiment's wives, simple wooden desks, slates, and chalk. Alice may have learned her letters there, tracing her name while the ground vibrated with the thud of marching feet outside. In those early years, everything around her spoke of discipline and hierarchy. Men who saluted, mothers who waited, and rules that governed even laughter. It was a world built on the belief that structure could protect against chaos. But childhood has its own rebellions, quiet and unrecorded, the moments of wonder, of longing, of restlessness. Did she ever stand at the edge of the parade ground, watching her father vanish into the regiment's formation, feeling both pride and a strange loneliness? The census does not tell us. It only preserves the facts, the names, the ages, the place. Yet from those lines emerges the image of a child framed by the empire's certainty, unaware that her future would unfold in streets far rougher and darker than any barrack room. For now, though, the scene remains calm. A small house within the South Camp, smoke curling from the chimney, the clatter of boots outside, and a mother humming softly as evening falls. The empire sleeps. The child dreams. And in that faint cry heard first beneath the Bengal sun began the long, uneven story of Alice Tatlo, a story that would one day echo through the courts and prisons of Britain and leave historians searching for the child who once survived the heat of Jhansi, only to perish, little by little, in the cold of home. Morning at Aldershot always began with sound, the thin call of the bugle cut through mist and sleep, echoing over neat rows of wooden huts and parade grounds still wet with dew. Men stirred, belts tightened, boots laced, rifles gleamed. To a child like Alice, those sounds were as natural as birdsong. She grew up inside their rhythm, the precise footfall, the shouted command, the clatter of metal on stone. Discipline was not taught, it was breathed. For her father, Sergeant John Tatlo, this was the peak of his working life. To be an armorer was to be both craftsman and guardian. He repaired the instruments of war and kept the regiment's honor in order. In an age when poverty pressed on so many, his uniform gave the family stability and a modest respect. On the pay ledgers, his position sat proudly above the ordinary ranks. The army fed and housed its own. Mary Ann shopped at the commissary, the children attended the regimental school, and on Sundays they walked together to chapel, their clothes brushed and buttons polished. Life, though limited, was steady. In later records, Aldershot appears as a simple line on paper, residence, South Camp. But behind those words was a city built entirely for war. The rows of huts, the gas lamps, the constant drilling. It was both home and machine. Soldiers' families learned to live inside that mechanism. They grew used to separations, men sent to training camps, deployments without warning, the sudden silence of absence. Perhaps that is where Alice first understood what it meant to wait. Children of regiments carried a strange mixture of pride and solitude. They belonged to no single parish, for the regiment itself was their parish. They were citizens of movement, their play bounded by fences and orders. If they misbehaved, it was the sergeant major, not a neighbor, who scolded them. And always there was the awareness that their lives were temporary, borrowed from the army's needs. A posting could end at any time. Friendships began and ended with the sound of wheels on gravel. By the mid-1880s, the Tatlos would have sensed change. The empire was vast but restless. Campaigns in Egypt and Sudan demanded men, and rumors drifted through the barracks of new postings. Perhaps John longed for promotion, or perhaps the years of service weighed heavy. He had spent decades under orders, maintaining weapons he would never fire. In the evenings, he might have sat polishing a bayonet by lamplight, watching his children sleep, wondering if their lives would escape the barrack walls. Little Alice was growing quickly. The census of 1881 marked her as a scholar, a single hopeful word amid columns of military data. That entry tells us something delicate and rare. Her parents wanted her educated. For the daughters of non-commissioned officers, schooling meant more than letters. It was a path to respectability. In Britain's class-bound world, education was one of the few forms of armor a poor girl could wear. But the quiet order of Aldershot could not last. Soldiers' families moved as regiments did, following the call of duty. At some point in the late 1880s, the Tatlos left the barracks and traveled north to the Midlands, a place humming with factories and fire. The shift must have felt like a fall from the predictable rhythm of army life into something louder, more chaotic. The date we know precisely. By the time of the 1891 census, they are recorded not among soldiers, but civilians living on Lower Tower Street, Birmingham. What happened between those two enumerations is not written, but we can imagine the gradual unraveling of military certainty. Perhaps John retired on pension. Perhaps illness forced him from service. Perhaps the army itself, in its impersonal way, simply released him when his usefulness ended. Families like the Tatlos often found themselves adrift once the uniform came off. The army provided structure, housing, and identity. Outside it, England offered only the competition of the working class. For a man trained to maintain rifles, the civilian labor market had little to offer. The journey from Aldershot to Birmingham was more than a change of address. It was the beginning of decline. The town they entered was already the workshop of the world. Endless smoke, furnaces, the rattle of trams. Streets were lined with lodging houses and small forges where men and boys made the tools of empire: bolts, locks, bullets, toys. Poverty and pride lived side by side there. It was no place for nostalgia. The soldiers' discipline dissolved into the noise. In their small rented rooms, the Tatlos joined thousands of families who had once believed in the promise of steady work. For Mary Ann, used to the ordered life of the barracks, Birmingham must have been overwhelming. The air itself was thick with soot. Shops stayed open late, and neighbors shouted across thin walls. Still, she did what women had always done. She kept the household together. The census of 1891 captures a quiet but telling detail. Mary Ann Tatlo, head of household. John's name is missing. He was not dead. Military records suggest he was alive somewhere, perhaps serving or lodging elsewhere for work. But his absence meant that at the moment the census man knocked, Mary stood alone at the door. 6 children crowded behind her, 2 of them, John and Robert, already working as brass founders, following the city's trade. Among the younger ones is Alice, age 12, birthplace still proudly listed as India. It's such a small entry, but its implications run deep. The title head of household for a soldier's wife was rare, and it hints at both independence and hardship. Alice was entering adolescence in a home led by a mother who managed without a husband's daily presence, in a street dense with noise and drink and factory smoke. The discipline of the parade ground had vanished. In its place came the free-for-all of industrial survival. If we pause here, at this threshold between the order of Aldershot and the chaos of Birmingham, We can almost see the shape of her future forming. The skills she learned in the barracks, obedience, silence, waiting, were ill-suited to a city that rewarded cunning and endurance. Yet the mark of her father's trade, the neatness, the precision, may have remained in her even as the world around her grew rougher. Children born into discipline often crave freedom, but freedom without guidance can feel like falling. Somewhere in those Birmingham years, perhaps walking home through the clang of foundries, she must have felt that the life of order and respect she once knew was already receding, replaced by something noisier, harder, and more indifferent. The census leaves her there, 12 years old, her birthplace a distant son, her father somewhere unseen. The next time her name will appear, a decade will have passed, and the world around her will have changed beyond recognition. The child who once listened to bugle calls now woke to the hammer of machines. In Birmingham, mornings arrive not with trumpet notes, but with the hiss of steam, the clang of anvils, the sharp cries of street vendors calling their wares. The air itself was thick and metallic, a kind of living fog that never quite cleared. This was the city of brass and smoke, where industry beat like a relentless heart. It was here, among its restless streets, that Alice Tatlo learned how to disappear. Lower Tower Street lay close to the city's foundries, a maze of narrow courts and brick terraces, pressed against one another like exhausted lungs. Coal smoke blackened the windows, and a constant vibration from nearby workshops shook the glass. To grow up here was to grow up among noise. Men coughed soot, women scrubbed steps, children darted through alleyways chasing one another beneath washing lines. Life was hard but communal, stitched together by habit and necessity. The neighbors all knew one another's business, yet behind the chatter there was also deep fatigue. Survival required both toughness and silence. Mary Ann Tatlo, recorded as the head of the household, would have risen before dawn to light the fire, boil water, mend uniforms or shirts for her sons who labored in the brass works. Her hands, once used to the careful domestic order of a military camp, grew raw from scouring and soap. There was no parade ground here, only the rhythm of unpaid work. For women like her, respectability was fragile and endlessly defended, measured in clean aprons, church attendance, and the behavior of children. Yet even those small defenses could crumble under poverty's weight. And there, in the middle of this crowded house, was 12-year-old Alice. We can picture her seated by the window, perhaps with a primer or a scrap of paper from school, the weak daylight falling on her face, her hair tied back with a piece of ribbon, her clothes patched but tidy. She is listed as a scholar in 1891, meaning she still attended school. But what chance did such children have of education when every day was a competition between hunger and duty? Many girls her age left school before 13 to enter service or factory work. Their small wages helped keep families afloat, yet cost them the fragile dream of advancement. No letters survive from the Tatlos, no diary in which a mother might have recorded her worries, no photograph to show the faces behind the census lines. Yet the record's silence can tell us much. Between this census and the next, the family's trail goes dim, the usual fate of working-class households who moved frequently, following rent or work. By the time the next official document appears, Alice is an adult and already unraveling. Something in those unrecorded years must have shifted, perhaps quietly, perhaps catastrophically. The Birmingham of the 1890s was a city of contradictions. Prosperous manufacturers lived beside desperate slum dwellers. Public houses outnumbered churches, and gin was cheaper than milk. Reformers called it the workshop of the world, but for many women it was also a workshop of exhaustion. Domestic service remained the main escape from factory life. Young girls could find places as maids, cooks, or nursemaids in middle-class homes, but the work was long, the pay poor, and the scrutiny endless. A servant's life was one of invisibility. They lived beneath the stairs, ate after their employers, and were dismissed for the smallest offenses. Many drifted between jobs, carrying bundles of worn clothing and a reference letter folded in a pocket. If a girl lost that letter, her respectability went with it. It is easy to imagine Alice among them, a small, fair-haired girl of quiet manners, moving through the edges of other people's comfort. In this world, loneliness could become its own language. The city offered distractions, music halls, markets, cheap lodging houses, but also temptations that punished those who yielded. Respectable women were watched constantly. Any rumor of impropriety could destroy them. Alcohol became a refuge that society would not forgive. We don't know when the first drink found her. Perhaps it was in a servant's kitchen after a long day, or in a public house near the factory gates where girls gathered to talk. The taste might have offered warmth, a sense of companionship, a way to soften the cold edges of working life. Many of the women later described in court as drunk and disorderly were not violent by nature. They were lonely, underfed, and exhausted. Drink was the only luxury within reach. But once a woman was seen drunk in public, the descent could be swift. Employers dismissed her. Landlords refused rooms. The police took note. In Alice's later records, the word habitual will appear beside her name. Habitual drunkard, habitual offender. The repetition of that word suggests inevitability, but all habits have beginnings. In those lost 10 years, somewhere between adolescence and womanhood, she crossed an invisible line, from the world of the respectable poor to the world of the watched and condemned. Her father's fate remains uncertain. He may have died before 1901 or simply drifted out of the family's life, his pension small, his health failing. If he was gone, then the last stabilizing figure from her childhood disappeared too. A father's authority could be harsh, but its absence left a void that poverty quickly filled. Mary Ann's struggle to maintain the household would have deepened. Her daughters, now young women, faced choices none of them could afford. By 1901, the official record falls silent on the Tatlo family. They vanish from the census, or perhaps their names were misspelled, lost among the thousands of inked lines. It is as though the family simply dissolved into the city's vast machinery. For researchers, this silence is both obstacle and clue. When the archives go quiet, it usually means movement. People displaced, separated, or hiding. 10 years later, when a name resembling hers appears in a small newspaper from Wales, a young woman called Violet Beardsmore, drunk and distressed in court, it will make historians pause. Could it be the same person? The ages and origins fit. The habits fit, too. If it was her, then by her early 20s she was already wandering beyond Birmingham, already marked by drink and desperation. The girl from the military barracks had become the woman in the dock. Standing at this turning point in her story, one can almost feel the air thicken around her. Behind the noise of factories and the laughter of taverns, another rhythm was beginning. The slow, repetitive beat of the court gavel that would soon measure the rest of her life. How does a life slide from order to oblivion so quietly that even history loses its place? Perhaps the next record, the next fragile clue will tell us. For nearly 10 years, the world lost sight of Alice Tatlo. The girl from Lower Tower Street stepped out of the census and into the blank margins of history. Such disappearances were not unusual. Working-class lives were fragile, often unrecorded between births and deaths. But when the record finally finds her again, she is no longer a child nor even quite the same person. The name has changed. The place has changed. What remains constant is the faint trace of distress that threads through every account to come. It is March 1901. The Aberystwyth Observer, a small Welsh newspaper, prints a brief report about a young woman charged with being drunk and disorderly. Her name is given as Violet Beardsmore, a domestic servant from Birmingham. She appears before the magistrates pale and trembling, described as being in a very distressed state. The court, perhaps moved by her condition, decides not to imprison her, but to send her to the infirmary for treatment. The article ends there, just a few lines among notices about stolen bicycles and market prices. But behind those few words lies the first hint of a double life. The name Violet Beardsmore will resurface again and again in years to come, and always beside the name Alice Tatlo. It is as though she were trying to step out of her own skin, to borrow another self for survival. Such aliases were common among women who drifted between cities and courts. A new name could mean a fresh start, or simply a brief shield against recognition. For a woman already known to the police, anonymity was a kind of mercy. We cannot know what brought her to Wales, perhaps a position in domestic service, perhaps flight from trouble in Birmingham. Servants moved often. They followed advertisements and whispers of employment, sometimes trusting strangers. A woman traveling alone, carrying little but a trunk and her reference letter, was always at risk. Service demanded silence and submission. It offered food and a roof, but no rest, no friendship, no protection from the men who treated servants as invisible. For some, a drink at day's end became a small act of rebellion against the endless humility the job required. The magistrates who saw Violet that day were unusually merciful. They chose care over punishment, an exception that tells us something about her state. If even in the stiff morality of 1901 she was seen as pitiable rather than wicked, her distress must have been clear. The infirmary would have offered little comfort. Whitewashed walls, the smell of carbolic, the restless moans of patients. But perhaps for a few nights she slept in a clean bed and woke without fear of the street. When she returned to Birmingham, she carried that same name like a shadow. The next records that mention her, the court reports of 1904, list both Alice and Violet interchangeably, as if the two had fused. By then, she was no longer a servant. Her addresses placed her in the poorer quarters of the city: Sheep Street, Moore Street, Buck Street, names that meant narrow rooms, thin walls, cheap lodging houses, where privacy was rare and violence common. The first time she appears under her real name again, it is not as the accused, but as a witness. A man has been killed in a drunken quarrel. The scene, reported in the Birmingham Mail, is grimly familiar. A public house, a fight over money, a razor drawn in anger. Alice testifies that she saw the weapon, that she heard the threat. Her account helps secure the conviction. The paper describes her as a woman of rough appearance. One imagines her standing in the witness box, eyes downcast, speaking softly, surrounded by men who see her only as part of the city's underworld. Her testimony is truthful, yet her presence there signals how far she has already drifted from the life her father once built. A few months later, the reports turn darker. In October 1904, her name appears under a headline that could break a reader's heart. Unconscious in the police cell. The story describes a woman found lying on the floor of Moore Street Police Station, a strip of tape tied tightly around her neck. It had taken 20 minutes to revive her. The constable's report notes that she had been arrested for obtaining drink while on the blacklist, a legal register of those forbidden to buy alcohol under the Habitual Drunkards Act. To be placed on that list was to be publicly marked as hopeless. Publicans refused service. Police watched your every step. To defy the ban was to declare open war on respectability itself. In the early morning light of that cell, with her throat bruised and her mind clouded by drink, she must have felt the walls closing in. Suicide was still a crime in 1904. Even the attempt could end in prosecution. The same society that condemned her for drunkenness would now condemn her for despair. The newspapers offered no sympathy, only the faint moralism of the era. A sad case of self-destruction by a woman of intemperate habits. Yet behind that sentence lies a moment of raw humanity. Someone alone, cornered by poverty and shame, deciding she had reached the end. It is easy, from the distance of time, to treat such figures as archetypes: the fallen woman, the habitual offender, the moral warning. But imagine the silence of that cell, the rough blanket, the faint trickle of water from a tap, the slow return to consciousness. She had tried to end her story, and instead she was revived into it. The next day, she was charged in court, her neck still bandaged. The magistrate sentenced her not to help, but to custody. Once again, the machinery of law mistook a plea for pain. This was the moment when her path hardened into repetition. The documents that follow, court dockets, prison calendars, brief lines in local papers, record not progress but recurrence. Each arrest becomes an echo of the last, each sentence a copy of the one before. She had entered the revolving door of the early 20th century justice system, designed less to reform than to contain. If her father was still alive, we find no trace of his intervention. Perhaps he could not bear to watch. Perhaps he did not know. Families of disgraced women often erased them quietly, telling neighbors they had gone away. Respectability demanded silence. Yet somewhere, deep in those Birmingham streets, the soldier's daughter from India was still walking, breathing, drinking, surviving. History remembers her now as a figure of notoriety, but in that moment she was simply a young woman, trying to forget who she had once been. When the cell door closed behind her in 1904, something in Alice must have shifted. She had reached for an ending and instead found herself beginning again, but in a different kind of life, one governed not by freedom, but by routine arrest and return. The press, indifferent to nuance, began to recognize her face. Each appearance was another paragraph, another line in the story of Birmingham's fallen women. And yet, if you read carefully, the early reports still carry traces of pity. They speak of her as someone broken rather than cruel, as if the city itself sensed her ruin and could not quite look away. By 1905, she had already become familiar to the local police. Her name appears in the ledgers beside the same charge: drunk and disorderly, obtaining liquor while blacklisted, obstruction. The sentences were short, a week here, 14 days there, but the rhythm was relentless. In those years, the magistrate's court was a theater of repetition. Women filed through its narrow corridors daily, faces pale from drink or hunger, dresses stained, eyes lowered. Some pleaded for leniency, others stood silent, accepting judgment as routine. Alice belonged to neither group entirely. She was known to answer softly, sometimes even with a faint smile. Her defiance was quiet, almost weary, a kind of surrender performed with dignity. Prison life for women in Edwardian England was austere, but not violent. Cells were small, walls whitewashed, floors stone. Each inmate received a number, a coarse uniform, and a slate for daily work. The labor was designed for order, not rehabilitation: scrubbing, laundry, needlework. Silence was enforced, as though the system believed that muteness could replace repentance. For a woman like Alice, accustomed to the noise of taverns and streets, the stillness must have felt like suffocation. Yet within that stillness, she may have found a strange kind of safety: food, warmth, a place to sleep without fear. In the logic of poverty, even punishment could resemble refuge. Outside the prison walls, reformers were beginning to argue that habitual drunkards should be treated, not jailed. The Inebriates Act of 1898 had established special reformatories where women could be confined for years to cure their addiction. To modern ears, reformatory sounds benevolent, but in reality, these institutions blended medical experiment with moral discipline. They were part hospital, part prison. Birmingham had its own advocates for such schemes, and by 1906, Alice's name was known to them. In their reports, she appears as a type, a chronic case, unfit for ordinary custody. But the city had no place to send her. Its compassion, like its funds, was exhausted. That year, a different headline drew attention. The Nottingham Journal reported the trial of Alice Tatlo of Buck Street, Birmingham, charged with stealing a watch from a man found drunk in the road. The irony was bitter. The woman punished for drink had robbed another drunk. She was sentenced to 3 months in prison, her 23rd conviction. The article described her as a small, stout woman with fair hair and a defiant manner. It is one of the first physical glimpses we have of her. The girl from Jauncey transformed into the woman the papers called incorrigible. 3 months behind bars might seem brief, yet it was enough to erase what little remained of her reputation. In Edwardian society, female virtue was brittle. A single conviction for theft marked a woman as unclean. Repeated ones made her untouchable. Employers refused to hire her. Landladies would not rent to her. Released from prison, she walked out into a city that had already closed its doors. Those who had nowhere else went to the lodging houses near Digbeth and Dale End, places that the police watched closely and newspapers described with theatrical disgust. It was there, in the smoky common rooms of these houses, that she met others like herself, women whose names the city forgot, even as it judged them. The line between survival and crime was thin. To steal a purse could mean eating for a week. To fight back against a violent man could mean another sentence for assault. By 1907, her convictions included both. Each arrest confirmed the next. Each sentence deepened the inevitability. Policemen who once wrote her name carefully in the ledger now shortened it with a shrug. Tatlo. Known woman. Bureaucracy has its own cruelty. Not hatred, but indifference. In the same years, Birmingham's civic leaders were trying to present a cleaner face to the world. They built new public buildings, widened streets, and prided themselves on progress. But beneath the tram lines and the shining shop fronts lay a darker truth. The poor were being pushed out of sight. The police courts became the only place where their stories surfaced, if only for a moment before being buried again under official language. 3 months with hard labor, 6 words that erased an entire life's context. Then, in 1908, a small article appeared in the Paddington Times, hundreds of miles from the Midlands. It described a woman named Mary Moorcroftoft sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment for assaulting another woman, Alice Tatlo of Euston Road, London. The details are slight, but the meaning is clear. She had left Birmingham. Whether she fled, followed someone, or simply drifted is unknown. The city that had defined her was now behind her, and she was entering another world entirely, the capital, where the streets glittered but the alleys hid more misery than any provincial town could contain. London was different. Its scale swallowed individuals whole. In Birmingham, a woman could be notorious. In London, she was just another shadow among thousands. Yet even here, violence followed her. The assault case shows her not as the aggressor, but as the victim, a rare inversion of her usual role. Perhaps she had moved in search of anonymity. Perhaps she had believed she could start again. But the pattern of her life, poverty, drink, exposure, traveled with her like a second skin. The press forgot her for a while after that, and in that gap we can almost imagine a fragile calm. Maybe she found work again, or a man who offered shelter. Maybe she walked the parks on quiet mornings, remembering the sound of bugles from long ago. But history rarely grants such reprieves for long. The next record will show her back in Birmingham by 1913, standing once more before a magistrate. And this time, the charge will reveal not merely desperation, but the cruel economics of survival in a world that left women few choices. When the London noise faded behind her, Alice was no longer young. Her face had begun to thicken. Her eyes carried that faint redness known to police doctors as the mark of long drinking. Yet there was still something restless in her, some part of her that refused to surrender completely. The city had not broken her. It had only exhausted her. And so, like so many who left in failure, she turned back to the place that had once shaped her. Birmingham, its smoke, its streets, its endless noise, was still home, even if that word had long ceased to mean safety. The year was 1913, the eve of a new century's first great rupture. Factories were booming again, soldiers were being recruited, and reformers were marching through the city calling for votes for women and temperance for all. Beneath these banners of progress, Alice reappeared in the public record with a story that revealed just how little progress the poor had ever known. In February, the Nuneaton Observer reported on a case before the magistrates that they called one of the meanest ever heard. The defendant was a man named Arthur Franklin. The victim, a woman who had been living with him in a cramped back-to-back house on Guff Street, Birmingham. Her name, Alice Tatlo. The article is brief but devastating. Franklin was charged with living on the earnings of Alice Tatlo, the legal phrase used for men who profited from prostitution. The law called them living on the immoral earnings of women, but in truth it was often survival disguised as vice. The report states that she earned about £5 a week, a startling sum compared to factory wages. She paid the rent, bought the food, and gave Franklin what remained. The magistrate, in his high collar and measured outrage, called it a case of heartless exploitation and sentenced the man to 6 months' imprisonment. The court pitied her, but its pity ended the moment she stepped outside. To the city, she was both criminal and victim. Respectable society could not forgive women who sold their bodies, even when poverty left no other choice. The moralists spoke of temptation, the newspapers of degradation. Yet within those cold words lies another truth, that for many women like Alice, this was not a fall from grace but a strategy for survival. In a world where labor was scarce and reputations easily destroyed, her body was the only currency left. It is easy to imagine the room they shared, a single gas lamp, peeling wallpaper, a small bed against the wall. She might have believed, for a time, that Franklin cared for her. Loneliness is persuasive. A woman who has lost the world will cling to anyone who promises warmth, however false. But the records tell us what happened next. Less than a year later, her name reappeared in the Evening Dispatch under a new and terrible headline: Attempted Suicide at New Street Station. The report reads like a scene written in slow motion. It is April 1914, spring in Birmingham. The air still heavy with factory smoke. A railway detective patrolling New Street Station sees a woman step deliberately onto the track in front of an approaching train. He jumps down and pulls her back just in time. Witnesses say she whispered, "I want to die." When questioned, she tells him, "I've buried my brother and I don't want to live any longer." Her brother, Robert Tatlo, the brass worker from her childhood home, had recently died. The police charged her with attempting suicide. It was a crime that could not be forgiven, yet the newspaper's tone, for once, is almost tender. The journalist writes that she seemed heartbroken and tired. It is one of the rare moments when her inner life surfaces in words. Grief, exhaustion, and self-disgust form a chorus in that brief quote. She had seen the machinery of the law from every angle, defendant, witness, victim, and perhaps knew there was no place left for mercy. For the second time in her life, she had tried to escape the cycle entirely, and for the second time, the world refused to let her go. The station itself must have held meaning for her. Trains were symbols of departure, of movement, of the possibility of somewhere else. To step onto the track was to choose not only death, but also release from geography, from Birmingham, from memory, from the ceaseless turn of the courts. Yet the detective's reflexes were quicker than her despair. She was pulled back, handcuffed, and taken once more to the cells. The report notes she was remanded for inquiries, the bureaucracy's cold phrase for a life on pause. In the weeks that followed, another familiar name surfaced. In May 1914, a man named Andrew Franklin, almost certainly the same companion, was tried for robbery with violence against her. Alice appeared in court again, this time with visible injuries. She testified that Franklin had struck her, knocked her down, and stolen her satchel containing 15 shillings. Another witness confirmed her story, but the jury acquitted him. The newspapers said nothing more, only that she left the court in tears. There is something unbearably symbolic in that sequence, rescued from death, then beaten, then disbelieved. Each episode reveals a society both fascinated by and indifferent to her suffering. To the city's readers, she was a cautionary figure, her pain reduced to public entertainment. Yet if we pause and imagine her walking out of the courtroom, we can sense the private ruin behind the headlines. A woman who once watched soldiers march in order now stumbling through the streets of her childhood city, a heart divided between grief and defiance. The summer of 1914 brought more than her personal chaos. It brought war. The first recruiting posters appeared on walls, urging men to serve king and country. Factories shifted to armaments, parades marched once more through the squares. Perhaps she watched them, remembering her father's uniform, the polished rifles, the precision of the drills. For her, war was not a patriotic dream, but a memory of loss. The empire that had once fed her family now devoured its sons. In this convergence of personal despair and national upheaval, her story becomes almost unbearably quiet. The press, preoccupied with the front lines, mentions her less often. But silence does not mean peace. It means invisibility. She was still out there, living somewhere between the public house and the cell, between the promise of love and the certainty of ruin. For Alice, survival had always been a form of resistance. Yet in 1914, standing at the edge of the tracks, she had shown what that resistance cost. There was no redemption in her gesture, no moral lesson, only a weary wish to stop moving. And though the train did not take her, something in her life's direction had already changed. From that year forward, she would no longer be seen as a troubled woman in need of help, but as a hardened criminal, one of the worst characters in Birmingham, as a detective would soon call her. The line between victim and offender was gone, blurred beneath the noise of war and judgment. What remained was a name, an alias, and a history of sorrow written across the pages of every court ledger that followed. By the time war came in 1914, Alice had already been fighting one of her own for more than a decade. When Britain called its young men to arms, she was summoned again and again to the magistrate's bench. For her, the front line was not in France, but on the cobbled pavements of John Bright Street and the alleys behind the public houses. The city rallied under banners of patriotism. She drifted through its back doors, arrested for the same offenses that had long defined her: drunkenness, disorder, the occasional theft that bought another week's food. In the newspaper archives, her name returns like the tolling of a bell. 1915, 1916, 1917, each entry almost identical. The Birmingham Mail notes that she has appeared for the 88th time. She is 36 years old. The reporter lists her offenses, using obscene language, being drunk and disorderly, and then adds the phrase that will follow her forever: one of the worst characters in Birmingham. The words are small, but their judgment immense. They erase the woman and leave only the category. Outside the courthouse, the world was changing fast. Shell factories thundered day and night. Women in overalls took over the work of men gone to war. Posters showed brave soldiers marching into light. Alice's march was between the police wagon and the cell. Sometimes she shouted, sometimes she stayed silent. In one account, she told the constable who held her arm, "I'll be back before the week's out." It wasn't defiance so much as weary accuracy. The penal calendar lists the rhythm of her days with bureaucratic precision. A week in Winson Green prison, release, another arrest, 1 month with hard labor, release, then again. Each sentence a brief pause before repetition. Inside, her hands stitched coarse garments for the army, she, the drunkard, helping to clothe the empire. The irony must have stung those who still remembered her father polishing rifles at Aldershot. The authorities kept count because counting was easier than understanding. To the police, she was a statistic of vice. To the magistrates, a failure of temperance. But occasionally, amid the reports, a line of humanity survives. One sergeant testified that when sober, she was civil enough and speaks kindly. Another noted she would share her bread with a stranger. Such remarks slipped into official minutes by accident, as though the truth had momentarily escaped. War magnified the city's contradictions. Patriotic parades passed the slums, where families queued for rations. While soldiers died abroad, the women left behind fought quieter battles with hunger and solitude. Alice's crimes fit uneasily into this moral landscape. She preyed, said the papers, upon soldiers and sailors in their cups. Yet these same soldiers sought her company, her laughter, her fleeting warmth. In another life, she might have been the daughter of a sergeant in uniform, waiting at a station to wave him off. Instead, she lingered near those platforms, hoping for coins or companionship. Every transaction blurred the line between survival and sin. The label of habitual drunkard became her identity. Under the habitual criminals register, the police recorded not just her convictions, but her body. Height, complexion, hair, eyes, even her tattoos, initials, clasped hands, the words true love. These marks, meant perhaps as declarations of feeling in her youth, were now used for surveillance. Each time she entered a cell, an officer compared the old notes to the woman before him, 5'1", stout, fair, blue-eyed. It was as if the state itself memorized her flesh. In 1918, as the war ended, her story reached its grim milestone. The Mail reported her 100th arrest. Detective Best told the court she was a danger to soldiers, one of the most notorious women in the city. The judge sentenced her to 12 months hard labor, remarking that no further leniency was possible. The newspaper printed his words without comment, a moral full stop. For the public, she was now beyond redemption. For Alice, the sentence was simply another winter indoors. Inside prison, time lost its edges. The women marched in silence, their steps echoing against stone. Some prayed, some cursed, some wept without sound. Alice, the habitual, had no tears left. When she was released again in 1919, Birmingham was celebrating peace. Crowds filled the streets, flags waved. She walked among them unseen, a ghost of the war's underside. The city promised reconstruction. She returned to the only routine it offered. It is tempting to read these years as a single downward slope, but there were moments, tiny, almost invisible, when she tried to climb. The registers show short gaps between sentences, as if she managed months of sobriety. Perhaps she worked briefly as a cleaner or took in washing. Perhaps someone offered her kindness. But each time, the world of respectability remained closed. Once a woman's name appeared in print beside words like drunkard or prostitute, it followed her like a shadow. There was no erasing it, no coming home. By the early 1920s, the war's victory had curdled into recession. Jobs vanished, rents rose, and the streets grew harsher. For Alice, the peace that Britain celebrated meant only hunger and the return of police patrols. The same constables who had served in the trenches now arrested her for swearing in public. They had seen corpses in ruin abroad. At home, they saw her as just another disturbance to order. And so the pattern continued: arrest, confinement, release, collapse. Her life became a loop that no Reform Act could break. To read the documents now is to feel their monotony, the slow erasure of individuality beneath the clerk's pen. Each entry closes with a date, a sentence, a signature, evidence that bureaucracy, not compassion, had the final word. If there is any mercy to be found in these records, it lies in their endurance. They keep her name alive even as they condemned it. Without them, she would have vanished entirely. Through the dry ink of police registers, we can still glimpse a flicker of motion. A small woman stepping out of the dock, the clink of chains, a brief glance toward the window where daylight spills onto the stone floor. Outside, the war memorials were rising, carved with names of the honored dead. Inside the courthouse, another name was being repeated for the 100th time. Not carved, not honored, but remembered all the same. When the bells of victory finally stopped ringing and the flags along New Street faded, Birmingham began to forget its soldiers and its sinners in equal measure. Alice emerged from her year of hard labor to find the world changed once again. Prices were high, jobs scarce, and the city's optimism, so fierce in 1918, had already turned brittle. For a woman known by every constable, there was no beginning again. There was only moving on. Sometime between the last months of the war and the dawn of peace, she left the Midlands for London. The registers do not tell us why, only that her name appears next among the cases heard at Paddington. She'd gone south before, years earlier, and perhaps the memory of anonymity had called her back. The capital was larger, louder, less curious about its poor. A woman could vanish there more easily. To disappear was its own small freedom. London in the 1920s was a restless city. The lights of the West End glimmered against a background of hunger and inflation. Crowds flowed through Oxford Street and Euston, streets not far from where she found a cheap room. The trains rumbled day and night, bringing home soldiers who carried their own ghosts. For those who had lived hard lives before the war, the peace felt strangely hollow. Charity missions offered tea and sermons. The police still patrolled the public houses as if time had stood still. Alice was no longer the desperate girl who once stepped onto a railway track. She was 40, short and thick-set, her face lined by years of rain and drink. But she still moved with that mixture of energy and defiance that unsettled the authorities. In 1920, the Birmingham Daily Gazette, still tracking her name even after her departure, reported that police in London had caught her in an act so practiced it might as well have been ritual. Together with a man called George Hughes, she had robbed a gentleman of his purse in Station Street. The method was described in clinical detail. She had embraced the victim as if in greeting, while her accomplice's hand slipped into the man's pocket. It was an old trick, known to every constable and still effective. When challenged, she laughed. She was sentenced once more, her total of convictions now impossible to count. That same year, another kind of record was made. The Habitual Criminals Register, a heavy leather-bound ledger kept in every police station, added her description in full. It is here that her physical self, once barely hinted at, emerges in forensic clarity. Height, 4 feet 11 and a half, complexion fresh, hair brown, eyes blue, build stout, and then the details that read like a sad inventory of memory. Tattoos, Prince of Wales feathers, heart, clasped hands, words, true love. Each mark turned from a token of feeling into evidence of identity, a permanent address inscribed on skin. There is a certain tenderness in these entries, though none was intended. The officers who wrote them were trained to observe, not to interpret, yet their lists of scars and symbols convey more humanity than the cold sentences of the courts. Her body had become her file, a living document that no alias could disguise. Even the scar on her lip, noted in 1921, told its own story, an injury from a fight, perhaps, or the mark of illness. The Police Gazette that year printed her face, grainy and unsmiling. To those who saw it, she was just another repeat offender. To us, she is suddenly visible again, caught in the single frozen instant that time allows. If Birmingham had been the city of her making, London was the city of her endurance. She knew its stations, its doorways, the smell of its cheap lodging houses. Some nights she would have slept in the women's ward of a workhouse, others in the kindness of a stranger's room. The line between charity and exploitation was thin. Men still followed her, some offering drink, others a bed. Companionship remained the currency of survival, traded for coins and silence. By 1928, her story had become almost theatrical. The Evening Dispatch described her 109th appearance in court, as if she were a performer with a grim encore. She was charged, as always, with being drunk and disorderly at New Street Station. This time the London version, a cruel echo of the Birmingham platform where she had once tried to die. The magistrate fined her 20 shillings. When asked if she could pay, she straightened herself and said, "Of course I can. I could pay £50, 100." The court laughed. For a brief second, she was not a defendant, but an actress commanding her audience. Pride, however hollow, was her last form of power. The laughter faded quickly. She left the dock with her small handbag clutched tight, perhaps containing only the fine itself. The reporter's tone, half amused and half admiring, caught something essential about her, an indestructible spirit that refused to be crushed by a lifetime of condemnation. In a world that valued obedience above endurance, defiance was its own kind of dignity. Around this time, the great social reform movements of the age were losing momentum. The temperance crusades had waned. The charities that once campaigned to save fallen women now turned their attention to housing and child welfare. For women like Alice, there was no longer even the thin promise of rescue. The law could punish, the missions could pray, but neither could imagine rehabilitation without repentance. And she was too honest for false sorrow. She drank, she fought, she survived. That was all. There is a haunting symmetry in these middle years. The girl born in the barracks of empire, surrounded by order and discipline, spent her adulthood in the disorder of streets that empire built. The empire itself was beginning to crumble. Its soldiers returned, its glory dimmed. She had lived through its expansion and its slow decline, carrying its contradictions in her body. Her tattoos of love and loyalty, once innocent emblems, now read like epitaphs for everything the century had promised and failed to deliver. By the decade's end, the record of her life had become almost complete. 100 arrests, a dozen aliases, a file thick with descriptions. Yet even now, between those official lines, the silence persists. No one recorded her laughter outside the court, the songs she might have known from the music halls, or the faces of those who still shared her company. To history, she remains the sum of her crimes. To the imagination, she is still walking through the fog, head held high, daring the night to forget her. Yet. And somewhere in that endless city, beyond the reach of reporters and police, perhaps she found a moment of calm, a small rented room, a kettle on the stove, the steady rain tapping on the window pane. She had lived for decades under the eyes of others. Perhaps she longed for nothing more than a single evening unobserved. The documents fall silent here. Her next trace will come years later, in a different county altogether, with a crime so trivial it reads like mercy. Between those 2 points, the woman in court and the woman in quiet, lies the space that official history never touches, the private endurance of a soul the world had already condemned. By the end of the 1920s, the century had lost its illusions. The songs that once filled the music halls now sounded tired, and the faces in the tram windows seemed older than their years. The war survivors had grown quiet, and a new kind of weariness settled over Britain, a weariness that had nothing to do with battle and everything to do with endurance. In this slower, grayer world, Alice Tatlo still moved between cities, still sought her living in the same uneasy ways. But something in her pace had changed. The sharp defiance that had once made reporters smile was softening into something else, an acceptance, perhaps, or simply the exhaustion of a woman who had spent half her life being watched. The trail that had followed her so faithfully through the newspapers begins, here, to blur. After her 1928 court appearance, the records go strangely quiet. For the first time in nearly 3 decades, her name is missing from the pages of the Mail and the Dispatch. It is as if she had stepped off the map. But the silence does not mean death. It only means distance. When her name finally reappears, it is not in the city that made her infamous, but in a rural one that seems almost pastoral by comparison. In November 1929, the Coventry Herald carried a small notice about a woman fined 7 shillings and 6pence for riding a bicycle without a rear light. Her name was given as Alice Tatlo of the Larches, Clay, Warwickshire. The offense was trivial, almost comical, a far cry from theft, disorder, or assault. Yet that small line glows with possibility. Could this be the same woman? The name was unusual enough to raise the question, and the geography made sense. Coventry lay only a few miles north of Birmingham, close enough for a familiar train journey, far enough to vanish into anonymity. If it was her, then something remarkable had happened. At 51, she was no longer the drunken figure dragged through courtrooms, but a woman living in the countryside, fined for the same minor carelessness that might have caught anyone on a dark road. The simplicity of the offense reads almost like peace. After decades of turmoil, to be punished for a broken lamp instead of a broken life might have felt like grace. The Larches itself was a quiet lane lined with hedges and small cottages, the kind of place where everyone knew the milkman and the sound of a bicycle bell carried across the fields. One can almost picture her there, a stout woman in a long coat, pedaling steadily home as the last light fades, the air smelling of smoke and damp earth. The constable who stopped her would have seen only another working woman on an old machine. Perhaps she smiled as she paid the fine, relieved to be treated like anyone else. After so many years of infamy, even a moment of ordinariness could feel like forgiveness. Then once again, the record fades. A decade passes before we find her name in any official document. The 1930s were cruel to many. The Depression, unemployment, and the slow tightening of another war's shadow. For Alice, already hardened by poverty, the decade might have seemed almost calm by comparison. The archives say nothing about her, and perhaps that was her greatest triumph, to live 10 years without her name appearing in print. The silence ends in 1939, with the National Register compiled on the eve of the Second World War. Among the millions of entries, one line stands out: Tatlo, Alice Mor. The birth date is exact, 27 August 1877, and the birthplace, India. There's no doubt. After years of aliases, of names half remembered and half invented, the record finally restores her full identity. She is listed at 13 Formosa Street, Paddington, London. Her occupation is given as domestic duties. Living with her is a man named Henry Lane, a street trader 21 years her junior. The clerk has written her surname twice, first as Tatlo and then crossed it out to write Lane. The two names share the same address. Perhaps they shared the same life. The image that emerges is quieter than we might expect. Domestic duties, a small rented flat, a younger companion who sells things on the street. It is not redemption, but it is survival. The woman once called one of the worst in Birmingham was now just another tenant in a London building. Her crimes reduced to whispers among neighbors who probably never asked. The city that once devoured her had finally grown indifferent, and in that indifference, she found space to exist. The 1939 Register is one of those rare documents that freeze a moment of stillness between storms. The first bombs would fall a year later, but for that brief autumn, the country still breathed in uneasy peace. Perhaps Alice stood by the window of her Paddington flat and watched the city's lights being dimmed for blackout drills, remembering another war that had taken her brothers and her youth. She would have been 62, an old age she could never have imagined in her cell years. And yet even here, the quiet does not last. In August 1943, her name returns to the press, this time in the Marylebone and Paddington Mercury. The report is painfully familiar. Alice Mor Tatlo, age 65, charged with stealing a wallet. The method, too, is the same as before. She stopped a man in the street, asked for a cigarette, and as he struck the match, she slipped the wallet from his pocket. When caught, she denied it. "I can prove I wasn't there," she told the magistrate, though the police knew her too well. The court, weary and distracted by wartime chaos, recorded only that she had a large number of previous convictions for larceny and drunkenness. The sentence was short, but the meaning was clear. After decades of living on the margins, she had returned to the only role the world still recognized. That small wartime case is the last trace of her life. The following years fall into silence again. No more reports, no more addresses. The official records list 2 deaths that might have been hers. one registered in Birmingham in 1960, another in Surrey in 1965. Both women were in their 80s. Both carried her name. Whether either belonged to her, we cannot know. But it comforts the imagination to think that she might have reached such an age, to think that somewhere, far from the courts and cells, she simply grew old. In the end, the story that began in the heat of India closes in the chill of London. From empire to alleyway, from brass and bugles to soot and silence, she lived a life most would have dismissed as failure. Yet within that failure lies an extraordinary kind of persistence. She endured the state's cruelty, society's scorn, and her own despair, and somehow remained visible. An unerasable figure walking through the decades with her head lifted against the rain. Perhaps she died quietly, perhaps not. The papers do not tell us. What remains is her trace on ink and film, her small defiance preserved in archives she never meant to enter. And if, in her final years, she once again rode a bicycle through the dim lanes of memory, we can imagine her lamp finally working, its faint circle of light moving forward through the dark. When the final record fades, what remains of a life like Alice Tatlo's? Not the possessions, there were none to keep. Not the letters, she likely never wrote any. What endures are the small traces left in other people's hands, the clerk's careful ink, the reporter's brief column, the constable's indifferent note. Each of these fragments carries a fragment of her, and together they form a portrait more enduring than she could have imagined. But what that portrait shows is not wickedness, it is survival. The story we have followed, birth in India, childhood among soldiers, the long descent through courts and cells, ends not with punishment or redemption, but with a quiet disappearance. Somewhere after 1943, the files close. She is 65, her hair gray, her back bent slightly from years of walking the same pavements. The war that surrounds her is not hers to fight, yet it touches everything, the ration queues, the sirens, the nights spent in blackout. Perhaps she looked up once at the searchlights crossing the London sky and thought of the bugles at Aldershot, those first bright sounds of her childhood now echoing in her mind like ghosts. If she lived to see peace again, it would have been a quieter, lonelier world. The country rebuilt itself with new order and new optimism, but people like her did not belong in those bright post-war plans. The welfare state promised to protect the poor, yet it had no memory for the generations who had fallen before it. Her kind had paved the way for compassion through their suffering. Now they were relics of a harsher time. She might have watched the clean new housing estates rise where the slums once stood and wondered what it would have been like to live there when she was young. We will never know where her body rests. 2 death certificates carry her name, one in Birmingham, one in Surrey. Both could be her. Both could belong to someone else entirely. The ambiguity feels appropriate. For a woman who had lived half her life under aliases, even death refused to pin her down. It is possible that she returned in her last years to the Midlands, to the city that had once called her its worst character, and that she died there quietly, an old woman in a small lodging room. It is equally possible that she remained in London, fading into the anonymity of the crowd. The truth lies somewhere in the silence between. What we do know is that her story outlived her. Long after her death, her name continues to surface in police records, in research files, in the patient work of historians piecing together the lives of those the 19th century sought to forget. They find her fingerprints, her tattoos, her aliases. Violet Beardsmore, Annie Harris, Alice O'Donnell, and through them reconstruct the arc of a human being shaped by poverty and empire. Each discovery adds another thread to a tapestry she never meant to leave behind. To read those threads is to glimpse the broader pattern of her time. Alice was not alone. Across Britain, thousands of women followed similar paths, born into modest hope, undone by circumstance, punished for weakness, erased by shame. The system that judged them was designed to maintain order, not mercy. Drunkenness was a moral failure. Despair was a crime. The prisons filled with women whose only sin was exhaustion. Yet within that system, figures like Alice endure as quiet witnesses. Their records reveal not corruption, but the limits of the society that condemned them. The temptation, when telling her story, is to look for lessons, to ask what it means, what it warns us of. But perhaps the truest response is simply to listen, to sit with the weight of her endurance, the strange beauty of her persistence. Hers was a life without glamour or victory, yet there is a kind of grace in how she continued to walk, to speak, to laugh even when the world had long ceased to hear her. The historian can trace her movements but not her thoughts. Only imagination can fill that final silence. So let us imagine her one last time, an elderly woman in a faded coat, walking along the embankment at dusk. The Thames glitters with the reflections of street lamps, and the city hums around her. She pauses on a bridge, watching the water slide beneath, and for a moment, her face softens. Perhaps she remembers India, the glare of the sun on white walls, her father's voice calling orders, her mother's hand wiping sweat from her forehead. Perhaps she thinks of Birmingham, of the clang of metal and the smell of coal. Or perhaps she thinks of nothing at all, only the calm of standing still while the world moves. When she turns to leave, no one notices. The crowd swallows her gently, as it always has. Somewhere behind her, a clock strikes the hour. Somewhere ahead, a door opens to another small room. She sets down her bag, lights a match, and watches the flame tremble for a moment before it steadies. That is how we might picture her end. Not tragic, not glorious, simply human. A life reduced to its simplest act, breath meeting time. The story that began with a soldier's child in a faraway garrison closes with an old woman in a rented room, surrounded by the hum of a city that has forgotten her name. And yet, we have remembered it. In every record searched, every headline reread, every moment we pause to picture her walking again through the fog, she lives a little longer. The state kept her alive in its ledgers. History keeps her alive in its questions. What does it mean to survive so long only to vanish? What is the measure of a life that leaves nothing but fragments? There is no clear answer, only the echo of her footsteps fading into the noise of the street and the faint suggestion that even in failure there is a kind of endurance that defies judgment. Perhaps that is enough. Every life leaves behind its witnesses. Some are family, some are enemies, and some are the slow, impartial scribes of the state. For Alice, it was the latter. Her existence was not recorded in memory, but in ink. Even after her voice fell silent, the system she fought against continued to speak her name, on registers, on lists, on the yellowing pages of prison calendars. In the quiet after 1943, these traces are all that remain, and yet together they create a kind of echo, faint, uneven, but still human. It is here, in this echo, that her story merges with something larger. Alice was one of many, women born into the narrowest corners of Victorian respectability, whose lives became case studies for moralists and reformers. They filled the police courts of industrial Britain, their names repeated in headlines that were never meant to endure. To most readers, they were cautionary figures. To historians, they are now the measure of a society's failure to imagine mercy. When we read about her now, the numbers stand out first. 110 convictions, dozens of aliases, a lifetime of hard labor sentences that totaled more years than most marriages survived. The repetition seems almost impossible, yet each entry was real, each one a day lived in that narrow space between freedom and confinement. For Alice, crime was not adventure, it was rhythm. It was the only pattern that made sense in a life stripped of stability. And like so many others, she learned to survive within the machinery that was meant to crush her. Birmingham's courts called her incorrigible. London's called her notorious. But neither word captures the truth of her endurance. To be called incorrigible is to have refused correction. To be notorious is to have been seen too often. Both labels speak more about the gaze of authority than about the person beneath it. What the police saw was repetition. What the public saw was spectacle. What neither saw was the steady, quiet pulse of survival, the small acts of endurance that make up a life unloved and unprotected. The society that condemned her was itself in turmoil. Britain in the early 20th century was a place of shifting ground. Women were gaining the vote, unions were demanding justice, and the empire that had once defined identity was beginning to crumble. Yet at the bottom of that changing world, the same old punishments remained. The drunk, the destitute, the women who sold themselves for shelter, all were still treated as moral failures rather than casualties of circumstance. The court spoke the language of reform while practicing the habits of control. If Alice had been born a generation later, her story might have ended differently. The social workers of the 1940s would have called her a woman at risk. The doctors of the 1950s might have spoken of trauma or addiction rather than sin. But in her own time, those words did not exist. Not. The only diagnosis available to women like her was character. You were good or bad, clean or fallen, deserving or unworthy. Once branded, the mark stayed for life. Her tattoos, the feathers, the heart. The words true love were only the visible version of that deeper inscription, the label the world would not let her shed. The tragedy of Alice's story lies not only in what happened to her, but in what it reveals about everyone around her. Each arrest required a constable, each trial a magistrate, each imprisonment a matron, each report a journalist. All of them saw her. None of them reached her. It is tempting to wonder how many might have paused, even briefly, to ask what she needed rather than what she had done. But the system left little room for such questions. Justice, in her era, was measured in sentences, not silences. And yet, even within that system, there were flashes of kindness. The constable who cut the tape from her neck in 1904. The magistrate who sent Violet Beardsmore to the infirmary instead of the cell. The detective who pulled her from the tracks at New Street Station. Small mercies, brief rescues, forgotten by all but her. They did not save her life, but they extended it, piece by piece. And perhaps that was enough to let her live long enough to grow old, a rare privilege among her peers. When we look back from our century, her story seems both impossibly distant and unsettlingly familiar. Addiction, loneliness, the cycle of punishment, these are not relics of the past. The machinery has changed its language, but not its nature. The courts no longer list women as habitual drunkards, but the prisons still fill with those whose poverty looks like crime. In that sense, Alice has never entirely left us. Her century speaks through ours in quieter ways. In the end, her life tells us less about crime than about care, about what happens when care is absent or conditional or withheld. The city that once called her its shame was also the city that built the weapons of empire, that celebrated discipline and industry while discarding those who could not sustain them. She belonged to Birmingham and London, not because she chose them, but because they shaped her survival. Every drink she took, every theft she committed, was a small protest against invisibility, a demand to be seen, even if only by the constable who arrested her. When the listener closes their eyes tonight and lets her story settle, they may hear the faint rhythm of her footsteps on cobblestones, the murmured laughter of a woman who refuses to vanish completely. There is sadness in that sound, but also strength. For though her body is gone, her trace remains, reminding us that history is not made only by the powerful and the proud, but also by those who lived unseen and endured anyway. In that endurance lies a strange kind of grace, a beauty born not of virtue but of survival itself. It is the beauty of a woman who kept breathing long after the world had stopped listening, who walked through smoke and judgment and somehow reached the quiet beyond. And so, as her story slips finally into silence, perhaps the last words belong not to the state that condemned her, but to the listener who remembers her. A life once, there is a strange quiet in the thought that the only reason we know Alice's face is because someone photographed her for the habitual drunkard's register. The image was not meant to preserve her humanity, only to confirm her capture. Yet it endures as the truest trace of her existence. The picture, faded, grainy, eyes direct but not pleading, confronts us across more than a century. It is the gaze of someone who has stopped expecting understanding, but still insists on being seen. Those who studied the social question at the turn of the century, reformers, journalists, moral philosophers, believed that by classifying vice, they could cure it. They invented new forms of record-keeping, anthropometric cards, fingerprint archives, and above all, the photograph. Each new technology promised order, a way to catalog the unruly, but the faces in those ledgers stare back with a silent kind of accusation. Their owners had been named, numbered, measured, and reduced. What none of the science could contain was the flicker of personality that still survived in the eyes. In her file, the clerk wrote height 4 feet 11 and a half, stout build, fresh complexion, brown hair, blue eyes. Below that, in the cramped hand of a police sergeant, are the tattoos, initials, Prince of Wales feathers, a heart, clasped hands, words, true love. These are the remnants of another life, the sailor's symbols of loyalty and luck, etched on the skin of a woman who had none of either. Perhaps they were made in her youth, before respectability slipped away, when love was still something that promised safety. Later, they would become proof of identity, the body turned into its own evidence. The bureaucratic poetry of these descriptions reveals more than it intends. Fresh complexion suggests a moment of care. Stout implies strength as much as heaviness. Even in classification, there are traces of affection, accidental or otherwise. The system that punished her also kept her alive in ink. It is one of history's small mercies that the machinery of control sometimes preserves what compassion forgets. As the decades passed, that machinery grew ever more elaborate. The police gazettes circulated her image to other towns. Wardresses copied her features into logbooks. Magistrates quoted her record as justification for yet another sentence. Each reproduction of her name was both erasure and resurrection. She could not escape her past, but neither could it be forgotten. In this way, the state became her unwilling biographer, chronicling a life it did not value. There is something almost tender in the rhythm of those reports, the endless repetition of the same charges, the same small punishments. They read like a rosary of failure, each bead a night in the cell, a week on remand, a month with hard labor. Yet within that monotony, a pattern of endurance emerges. She was still there, still walking, still answering when called. When the clerk asked her to confirm her name, she did. When they listed her aliases, she corrected them if they were wrong. Even as the system stripped her of dignity, she held on to the small authority of accuracy. To the social theorists of the early 20th century, women like Alice were the embodiment of the habitual. Their misdeeds seen not as choices, but as symptoms. The word itself carries a double edge. Habitual implies repetition, but also persistence. It is the mark of what cannot be broken. Reformers imagined that confinement could cure habit. Alice's life proved otherwise. Her offenses did not escalate. They simply continued, like breathing. The real habit was not drink or theft. It was survival itself. In the years when her photograph was taken, others like her filled the workhouses and reformatories. Many were younger, some barely out of adolescence. They arrived with stories much like hers, A father dead or missing, a mother overworked, a string of small employments that ended in dismissal, a fall into drink, then the slow drift into notoriety. The newspapers called them the unmanageable women, but what they truly were was unprotected. Society demanded virtue and offered no refuge. Alice, by contrast, had reached a peculiar kind of stability in her chaos. She no longer fought against the pattern. She inhabited it. When she was released, she returned to the same streets. When she was arrested, she went quietly. There is no record of her appealing a sentence, no sign of rebellion beyond the simple act of continuing to live. To modernize, that resignation might seem tragic, but to her it was probably peace. After all, to be predictable is also to be known. Even the constables who cursed her name understood her. In a world of strangers, that familiarity was something like belonging. It is tempting, standing this far away, to search for redemption in her story, to imagine a final change of heart, a last kindness received. But the document suggests something more complex, not redemption, but recognition. In her later years, when she stood in court and joked with the magistrate about paying £100 in fines, she was claiming her own script. The state may have written the lines, but she delivered them in her own voice. That is not defeat. It is authorship of a sort. The habitual criminals register that now preserves her likeness sits in an archive, its pages stiff with age. Each name around hers belonged to another life lost to bureaucracy. Yet among them, she stands out, not because her crimes were worse, but because her record is unusually complete. We can trace her almost year by year, city by city, conviction by conviction. The paper that was meant to bury her has, in time, become her monument. Perhaps that is what habit becomes when the world finally stops watching. Not a chain, but a rhythm, a memory that refuses to fade. To study her now is to confront the uncomfortable truth that systems of punishment often achieve the opposite of what they intend. They immortalize the very people they sought to erase. Alice's face, fixed forever in police ink, endures while the magistrates who sentenced her have long been forgotten. Somewhere in the quiet of that photograph, we can hear her thinking, no longer asking for forgiveness, no longer expecting understanding, only holding the gaze of history itself. And in that gaze, there is a question that has no answer. When does a life stop belonging to the years that followed her registration as a habitual, drifted quietly, like the soft gray between evening and night? By then, Alice had lived half a lifetime beneath the watchful eyes of the state. Each appearance before a magistrate was a familiar ritual, each release another small rehearsal of freedom. Yet as the 1920s waned, something in her seemed to soften, not repentance, not reform, but a gentler defiance, the kind that grows from exhaustion rather than rebellion. The newspapers, when they mentioned her at all, had begun to treat her as an old acquaintance. The Evening Dispatch in 1928 called her a well-known figure at the police court. The tone was not cruel, merely weary. A decade earlier, she had been described as dangerous. Now she was amusing. The transformation says as much about the city as it does about her. Birmingham had grown larger, louder, busier. Its people had survived a war and were learning uneasily to dance again. Against that backdrop, an aging drunk was no longer a scandal. She was a relic of a world the city wanted to forget. Her body, too, had changed. The prison records list her as shrinking with age. Once 5 feet 1.5, now barely 4'11". The years of hard labor, of standing at laundry vats and scrubbing stone floors, had compressed her frame. Yet those same records note her as in good spirits upon release, an observation so mundane and yet so remarkable that it almost glows on the page. She had learned how to smile for the clerk who signed her out, how to step again into the uncertain daylight. In her later trials, she began to perform a kind of rough humor. When the magistrate asked whether she could pay her fine, she declared, Of course I can. I can pay £50, 100. The courtroom laughed, and for a moment she held it as she might have once held a crowd in a tavern. Beneath the laughter, though, there is sadness. The joke was the only power left to her, the ability to make the audience see her not as a failure, but as a wit. Laughter, however brief, was a form of dignity. What does it mean to live a life so exposed, so publicly judged, and yet so forgotten at the same time? By her 50s, Alice had become one of those city ghosts that everyone recognized and no one truly saw. Shopkeepers might have nodded to her on the street. Constables might have exchanged weary glances when her name appeared again in the charge book. She belonged to the geography of the place, the pubs near New Street Station, the alleys behind the market, the cheap lodging houses that changed names as quickly as their tenants. The familiarity of her presence offered Birmingham a strange comfort. As long as she was there, the city could believe that its troubles were the same as they had always been. And yet, even as she played her small part in the theater of local notoriety, the world beyond her was shifting once again. The 1930s brought depression, unemployment, hunger marches. The optimism that had followed the war curdled into uncertainty. Factories closed, queues lengthened. In those years, many respectable families fell toward the edges where Alice had lived for decades. Poverty, which had once been seen as a moral failing, now began to look like a condition shared by thousands. Perhaps in some dim way the city finally caught up with her. If we could follow her through those streets, we might see her navigating them with the precision of long habit. She would have known which public houses served the strongest gin, which alleyways offered shelter from the rain, which constables were kind enough to look away. Experience had taught her how to read a city's temperament, the nights to stay hidden, the mornings to appear sober enough for work. It was, in its way, a profession, one that demanded observation, adaptability, and nerve. The most dangerous woman in Birmingham was, by middle age, more survivor than menace. The archives offer only small glimpses, a charge here, a remand there. Then almost suddenly the entries thin out. She appears less often, as if the city itself had begun to lose interest. Whether through declining health or sheer fatigue, her appearances in court became rare. There was a mercy in that absence. Perhaps she managed a quieter existence, eking out the small independence of obscurity. There were lodging houses then where an elderly woman could rent a bed for a few shillings a week, no questions asked. One imagines her there, sitting by a small window, watching the smoke rise from the factories that had outlasted her youth. In those fading years, the lines of her story begin to merge with the decline of the empire that had framed its beginning. The Britain that once ruled half the world now carried its wounds quietly, its veterans old, its cities tired. The empire had made her father's career and given her childhood a uniformed order. Its aftermath had scattered her into disorder. The rifles her father once tended were relics now, their polish dulled, their discipline forgotten. She, too, had become a relic, living testimony to a time when duty and punishment were the twin pillars of social order. And yet, within that decay, there was still life. Even in her 60s, the records describe her as talkative and cheerful when sober. Such phrases reveal a kind of humanity that the courts never intended to preserve. They tell us that she laughed, that she conversed, that she remained, to the end, unmistakably alive. The city may have tried to define her as an example of failure, but she refused to become a moral lesson. She was simply herself. It is easy to imagine her final years as a slow unwinding. The streets quieter, her steps slower, her face softened by time. Perhaps she lived long enough to see the electric trams replaced by motor buses, to watch the fashions of young women change, to notice that no one looked twice at a woman walking alone anymore. The social order that had condemned her was dissolving, and with it, perhaps, her guilt. The city no longer cared what she represented. For the first time, she could simply exist. History tends to measure lives by their loudest moments, but Alice's meaning lies in her persistence through the quiet ones. She outlived the institutions that punished her, outlasted the reformers who preached about her, and remained visible long after the empire that made her had turned to dust. Her story, reduced to ink and laughter, continues to travel through time, not as tragedy alone, but as testament. The next part of her story and of ours will lead beyond her death into reflection. What her endurance tells us about the country that shaped her and about ourselves as inheritors of its shadows. When history begins to fade into stillness, it often leaves behind the faintest glimmer, a soft light that falls not on glory, but on survival. For Alice, that glimmer comes in the most unexpected of places. A small notice in a rural newspaper, a trivial offense on a quiet lane. After the thunder of courtrooms and the clatter of prison gates, her life narrows to a single, almost comic line. Fined 7 shillings and 6pence for riding a bicycle without a rear light. It is 1929. The war has been over for a decade. She is 51 years old. Imagine her there, on the edge of Coventry, the wind lifting her coat, the countryside hushed in late autumn light. The Larches, her address, sits on the outskirts of Clay, a scatter of cottages set against low fields. The roads are narrow, their ditches lined with frost. A constable on patrol, lantern swinging, stops her. The conversation lasts only a minute. She smiles, perhaps laughs at herself. For once the story ends without shame, without headlines, without judgment. A woman fined for carelessness, not condemned for character. There is something tender in that image. The soldier's daughter, once labeled a danger to the city, now pedaling through open country, her crime no more than a forgotten lamp. It feels like the world's small apology, too late but sincere in its ordinariness. After years of being hunted, numbered, and confined, she is finally unremarkable. The cycle of crime becomes a literal one, a woman on 2 wheels moving through air instead of walls. We will never know how long she stayed there or why she left. But the silence that follows the report suggests peace. For the first time in decades, her name does not resurface in the papers, not until the eve of another war. 10 years pass, an extraordinary absence for a woman once known to the courts as incorrigible. The record becomes empty, and in that emptiness something beautiful unfolds, the possibility that she found rest. The 1939 Register confirms that the silence was not death, but transformation. Tatlo, Alice Mor, born 27 August 1877, birthplace India. A perfect match to the baptismal record from Jauncey. She is living at 13 Formosa Street, Paddington, London. Her occupation is recorded as domestic duties. Next to her name, written and then crossed out, is another, Lane. The man sharing her address is Henry Lane, a street trader 21 years younger. The detail is small, but in its ordinariness lies an entire world. Companionship, however uneven, and a home that is hers, however temporary. We can picture the room easily. A narrow flat above a shop, the walls yellowed by years of coal smoke, a kettle humming on the stove. She's in her 60s now. The window looks out onto a street of grocers, pawnbrokers, and barrows stacked with vegetables. Henry rises early to trade in the markets. She tidies, cooks, waits for him to return. They are not married, but it hardly matters. After a lifetime of institutions, she has achieved what the state could never imagine for her, an ordinary domestic peace. London itself has changed since she last drifted through its stations. The jazz clubs in Soho spill music into the streets. The old workhouses have become hospitals. Women vote now, smoke in public, and earn their own wages. The moral codes that once crushed her have softened. No one would call her fallen anymore, only poor. Perhaps she noticed the change, or perhaps it passed her by. People who have lived too long on the edge rarely trust in gentler times. But there must have been moments when she looked around her and realized that the world had, at last, caught up to her truth, that survival not virtue, is the greater courage. Then, as war approached again, the silence broke. In 1943, her name returned to the newspapers one last time. Alice Mor Tatlo, age 65, charged with stealing a wallet. The method was the same as ever. A friendly approach, a light offered for a cigarette, a hand that moved too quickly. When caught, she denied it. "I can prove I wasn't there." The police told the court she had a large number of previous convictions. The magistrate sighed and passed sentence, and with that, the curtain fell. It would be easy to see this as a sad ending, a final relapse. Yet there is something almost circular, almost comforting in her return to that small act of mischief. It was the gesture of someone who had never quite left her old self behind, a remnant of the spark that had carried her through the worst of her years. Even at 65, she still played the city at its own game, still refused to vanish quietly into invisibility. For her, to act was to exist. After that, the record stops. The rest is conjecture and quiet. 2 possible death certificates, one in Birmingham, one in Surrey, both plausible, both unprovable. In either case, she would have been in her 80s, which means that, despite everything, she lived longer than most of her generation. The empire that had once given her father work was gone. The streets that had witnessed her downfall were unrecognizable. The world had changed beyond measure, and she had outlasted it. It is strange. The thought that this woman, who spent her youth being dragged through courts, her middle years catalogued as a menace, her face printed in registers of vice, might have ended her life quietly, perhaps watering a small plant by the window, perhaps listening to the hum of traffic. The city that had punished her for being unruly now surrounded her with noise she did not have to answer to. For the first time, the sound of footsteps outside did not mean arrest. It was just London breathing. We cannot know what she felt in those final years, but we can imagine her looking back on the road she had traveled. From the heat of Bengal to the cold of English stone, from regimented childhood to the chaos of poverty, from notoriety to obscurity. Perhaps on some distant evening she remembered her father's discipline and her mother's hands and forgave them both. Or perhaps she remembered nothing at all, just the steady rhythm of living day after day, a rhythm that had become its own kind of peace. The record's silence is not emptiness, it is mercy. After so much noise, of trials, of headlines, of judgment, silence is the most dignified ending she could have been given. The soldier's daughter, who fought her own 4-decade war against loneliness and the law, finally found a place beyond documentation, beyond ink, beyond the need to explain herself. As we approach the close of her story, that quiet country light still lingers, the faint glow that marked her first freedom, and perhaps her last. The lamp on her bicycle may have gone out that night in 1929, but somewhere, years later, a different light still burned, small, steady, and entirely her own. When all the names have faded and the files have been closed, what remains of a life such as Alice's? Not the punishment, not the pity, but the faint outline of a human being who refused to disappear. Every record written against her, every court note, every prison ledger, every headline was meant to contain her. Yet all they really did was keep her alive long enough for us to find her again. That is her quiet revenge against the century that condemned her, to have endured beyond its judgment. The last time her name appeared in print, London was under the weight of war. Searchlights cut across the night sky, and sirens called people down into the shelters. Above ground, the city carried on, resilient and half-starved, a place of ration books and quiet endurance. It is within that atmosphere that she stands before a magistrate one final time, gray-haired, stout, with the faint remnants of her tattoos visible beneath the cuffs of her worn coat. The newspaper reports that she had stolen a wallet. Nothing more, just a short note in a column of petty crimes. A small act of mischief in a city already exhausted by larger ones. Yet even here, she shows the same unbroken spark that had carried her through 40 years of judgment. "I can prove I wasn't there," she insists. And in that line, you can almost hear the echo of her laughter from the courtrooms of her youth. After that, there is nothing. No address, no burial, no obituary. She slips finally into the stillness she had sought so many times before. The silence feels deliberate, as if she had chosen it. Perhaps she died in her sleep in that small Paddington room, the gas fire low, a cup of tea cooling beside her. Perhaps she was taken to a hospital and listed under another name, her past folded neatly away. Or perhaps she simply walked out into the London fog one evening and kept walking, leaving the city to wonder, briefly, what had become of her. However it ended, it was quiet, and after a lifetime of noise, that feels right. When we look back at her life, what we find is not a tale of vice, but of persistence. The persistence of those the world calls lost. For every empire that boasted of order, there were countless lives like hers, lives lived beneath its discipline, enduring its promises and its neglect. The girl born among soldiers in the heat of Bengal was shaped by the machinery of empire. The woman she became was broken by the same ideals when they reached home: respectability, duty, service. These words that once held her family together became the forces that cast her aside. But it would be wrong to imagine her only as a victim. There is a strange courage in her survival, a stubborn refusal to surrender completely to the narrative written for her. Even in despair, she chose movement. She walked from city to city, court to court, refusing the final stillness until it came on her own terms. That is not the passivity of tragedy. It is a form of endurance so ordinary it almost goes unnoticed. And yet, it is what keeps the world turning, the quiet, stubborn will to live in spite of everything. When historians open her file now, what they see first are the numbers, dates, addresses, convictions. But if they linger, they begin to sense something else: the rhythm of a woman's breath running beneath the bureaucratic pulse. A life is more than its documents. Between the inked lines lies the space where the human soul hides, the fear, the wit, the hunger, the small daily joys that no record can capture. It is there, in that unseen space, that Alice still lives. Her story is not unique. Across Britain, countless women shared her fate. Born into poverty, blamed for its consequences, forgotten by the progress they helped to build. They are the unrecorded majority, the invisible scaffolding of a society that has always relied on their labor, their silence, their sacrifice. History tends to remember the builders, not the scaffolds, yet without them, nothing stands. To tell her story now is to honor all those who were never meant to be remembered. It is tempting to end with hope, to imagine that if she could walk the streets today, she would find kindness where once she found condemnation. Perhaps she would. But her true gift is not the lesson she teaches. It is the question she leaves behind. What does it mean to be human when everything around you insists that you are not? How much of a person's worth depends on being seen, named, recorded? And when the record itself is the only proof of your existence, what happens when the ink fades? There is no answer, only the quiet continuation of her echo. In the dim rooms of archives, her name still catches the light. In the minds of those who read it, she becomes briefly alive again, a small woman in a long coat stepping out into the fog, head lifted, eyes sharp, unafraid. For a moment, she stands in the doorway between past and present, reminding us that history is never truly finished. It only sleeps until someone speaks its name. So let us leave her there, in that doorway. The courtrooms are empty now, the prisons long repurposed, the streets paved over. But somewhere, the sound of her footsteps remains, faint yet certain, moving steadily away. The soldier's daughter, the prisoner, the wanderer, the woman who could not be corrected, she walks toward her own horizon, carrying the memory of every woman who learned too late that freedom is rarely given. It is endured. And when the world grows quiet tonight, when you lie in the half-dark and listen to the distant hum of the city, perhaps you will hear her too, not the noise of her trials, not the clatter of her fall, but the soft rhythm of her walking, a reminder that every forgotten life leaves behind a trace, and that even in the deepest silence, the human heart continues to speak.